So speaking of fertilizer, that's what we're going to tackle with our first talk here today. And our first speaker is Kevin Seavers. Kevin comes with us from in Provincial Co-op Fertilizers Division, where he does that work. He graduated here from the Asper School, worked several years with ag retail in Alberta. He's been with the Federated Co-op as the Alberta fertilizer merchant, and since that you've been involved in buying and selling and getting the fertilizer in place that we need for spring. And I've always admired how the ag industry, farmers will fret over the winter and in the spring, and somehow we always seem to pull the rabbit out of the hat by getting fertilizer in place just in time. How's that happen? Kevin, come and give us the background on how we accomplished this. Welcome.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, John, for the introduction. So good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for having me here today. I'm very excited to be speaking here in front of all you folks today. And so when I was initially asked to speak at the Manitoba Agronomy Conference, initially I was just a little bit nervous. I figured I needed to throw this out there. I've just been compelled to tell you all, I'm not an agronomist, so I'm just coming clean on that right off the start. So if you ask too many technical questions, they're going right over my head. But my next step was I was looking at the agenda mostly yesterday, right? And so was pleased to see that there was many interesting topics, right? From herbicide resistance, genetic resistance, integrated weed management. And so, glad you folks talked about that yesterday, have that all solved and wrapped up, because today we're going to be talking about another, equally exciting and equally important topic of fertilizer logistics. So as John mentioned, my name is Kevin Seavers. I'm the Senior Fertilizer Manager for Federated Cooperatives. I got the pleasure of starting with the company in 2021 as their Alberta fertilizer merchant. And just real quickly, so our network, we're basically buying and selling the fertilizer on behalf of the co-ops across Western Canada. We have over 100 retail assets across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and into BC, 3 fertilizer terminals, and we're dealing with the full gambit of products, big and granular, but also in ammonia and liquid products as well. On an annual basis, we need to position well over 1 million tons annually, and so that's hopefully what we're going to talk a bit about today, is the logistics and what goes into that to ensure we have the right product in the right place for when we need it, and ultimately have our farmers be successful at growing their crops. Might need a quick hand here. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so on the agenda, what we're going to be looking through is the Western Canadian landscape, a bit about our manufacturing and import options, and then we're going to get more into Canada, our application timing, trends, just-in-time inventory, as well as explore some of our bottlenecks in terms of fertilizer logistics. Depending how time goes here today, we'll also get into how manufacturers gauge supply and demand, affordability, to hopefully position product at the right time in the right spot. And so, quick question for the group, any guesses in terms of what Western Canada uses per year in terms of fertilizer tonnage? Any Hail Mary launch? Millions, yeah. So it's right around 8.3 million was how many tons hit the ground in Western Canada. And so, if you look at this over time, we're using an all-time record amount of fertilizer across the prairies. And so, if you compare this into just, where we were 10 years ago, it's 33% more, over 2 million more tons hit the ground. And so with that, a lot more pressure in terms of what needs to be produced, what needs to be stored, and what needs to be shipped. And so, kind of the critical first step in understanding fertilizer logistics is understanding that we're using more products than we ever have. There we go. And so, I'm hoping to break this down a little bit, and we're going to get into the manufacturing and import options across Western Canada, because what you'll find is the infrastructure we have, that's going to tell a lot of the story, hopefully paint a picture in terms of which products we need to be focused on, and maybe which products we don't need to be focused on. And so on the screen here, these are your urea, UAN, and NH3 application rates in Western Canada over time. So you can see we're seeing the majority of our growth on the urea front, right? 4600. That product's grown over 1 million tons since 2016. While we're also seeing decent growth in the UAN and liquid front, while the ammonia market has maintained relatively flat or a little bit more variable over time. So the good news for the Western Canadian producer is that, in theory, there's ample nitrogen production across the prairies. So on the screen here, the sites marked with an N, those are your nitrogen producing plants. You've got CF in Medicine Hat. You have 4 nutrient plants in Alberta. You have Yarra, Belle Plaine, Saskatchewan. I know it's labeled Mosaic, but Yarra owns that one now. And then you have Coke Brandon, here in Manitoba. And so, get this screen to click, there we go. And so on the screen here, what you're looking at is the nameplate production. And then if you deduct our annual usage rates, you can get in theory, our excess capacity. And the one I want to focus on here a bit is, again, urea. And so what this graph is showing is it's our Western Canadian nameplate production rates less our usage rates for the same time period. And you can see how over the past 10 years, that's really been tightening up and snugging down. And so the other thing to consider here is this is nameplate production. And so it's not factoring in things like breakdowns and outages and planned maintenance that's further going to reduce this. And so if you want to dive into that one a little bit more, you can look at the Stats Canada data. And so that's what we have on the screen here. This is our annual exports in green and our annual imports in red on urea. And so again, looking 10 years ago, you can see that excess capacity we had available for export and how much that's really changed in the past 10 years, right? So the past 3 years, I would say specifically, we've been pretty close to balanced. And as of this year right now, we're trending towards being a net exporter a net importer versus being a net exporter. Okay, so looking at the sulfate production in Western Canada, in theory, there's quite a bit of decent supply available. In 2019, Nutrien stopped producing phosphates and twinned their ASG production in Alberta. And then between some of the other assets you have between, Chemtrade and Sherritt, and then also Tech in BC, there's ample sulfate production available. There's also, warehousing sites and just strategic distribution centers across Western Canada. And so your freight rates supplying sulfur aren't too bad across the prairies. Looking at potash, potash is quite similar here as well. And so another, quick question for the group. Any guesses in terms of how much potash Western Canada uses versus what we export on an annual basis? So option A, less than 2%, option B, 2 to 10%, C, 10 to 25, or more than 25%.
Less than 2%.
Thanks, John. Yeah, less than 2%. When I ran the numbers last, it was 1.9%. And so, if we're having a problem getting our potash supplies, there's something else wrong. We should be able to access it. So next, I'd like to speak about phosphate production. There we go. And so, if you were to ask me which product I spend my most time thinking about or worrying about, it's phosphates. And there's a couple reasons why. The first reason is that Canada has no domestic phosphate production. So as I mentioned earlier, when Nutrien shut down production in 2019 and moved to ASG, we have had no Canadian options. And so annually we're consuming about, call it 1.2, 1.3 million tons of phosphates, and those all need to be imported, right? And so as you can imagine, increased reliance on rail, increased reliance on trucking, and ultimately longer freight hauls for us to get our product here in time. The other thing we're seeing is that, the North American phosphate reserves are getting smaller. Read a couple publications, it seems like 35, 40 years is kind of what they're estimating. And so on the screen here, what you're looking at is the global phosphate reserves in terms of, who has the inventory. And the US does make this list, they're number 13, but if you compare them to, the big dog here, it's Morocco. Morocco has about 50 times the reserves as what the US has. And so again, as we're faced with decreasing supply, there's more chances you can hit some poor rock veins, and ultimately lowers our production rates and increases our reliance on offshore imports, which I'll get to here shortly. Okay, so if we're looking at our import options, as I mentioned, getting product from offshore into Western Canada, the two main stars I want to draw your attention to are those yellow ones. So the big one at the bottom, that's New Orleans, Louisiana, kind of our main import artery. Product's going to arrive there, travel north on barges along the Mississippi, and then in the summer it can get as far north as the Twin Cities and St. Paul, and in the winter it's getting somewhere around St. Louis and then needs to be railed in from there. The other option that's new is coming through Thunder Bay, and so and getting railed west from there. And so, as we all found out here today, the challenge is it tends to get cold up here, and so Thunder Bay is no longer an option throughout the winter months, right? As that area freezes up. So, those are your two import options. If you're looking at pulling product more domestically or from the U.S., your closest sites are these two green stars, the Simplot assets in Idaho. And then outside of that, you're going pretty far south, right? So you're going down to the Florida region where Nutrien Mosaic has the majority of their production assets. Okay, so we know North American supply has been dropping, right? So what are our import options? And so again, on the screen here, what you're looking at is the top 10 phosphate exporters globally. And one of the major factors impacting our phosphate supplies right now are countervailing duties in the US. And so if we go through kind of who these options are and if they're relevant for us, is you'll find that a few of them aren't, right? So right now there's duties on Moroccan product. I believe the last ruling had them at 16.81%. So the Moroccans aren't sending product to the US. If we look at number 2, there's China, but that country's had more of a focus on domestic supply security, so they've been exporting less as of late. If you look at number 3, they're also on that duty list, so the last ruling 18.21%, so they're not sending product to the US. Number 4, the Saudis are an option. And then number 5, as I mentioned, lower phosphate reserves. And the other thing that's impacting us specifically this year, and I'm sure a few folks have heard about this, is the hurricanes that have gone through Florida in the month of September. And so that's read multiple different estimates on this, but call it 500,000 to 600,000 tons. 500,000 tons was removed due to Hurricane Hilton and Helene. Shifting gears here a little bit and looking at what this looks like into Canada. We can't import the Chinese product, but we can import the Moroccan product. And so that's been one of the big factors kind of saving our Western Canadian phosphate supply. That can enter through the US through bonded warehouses, or it needs to come in, Thunder Bay would be another option for that one. The other comment I'll make on the Moroccan product saving our supply is that as you can imagine, you're not going to be able to snap your fingers and get product here from Morocco overnight. Mm-hmm. Call it a month from loading in Morocco, being vesseled over to New Orleans, and then up to another month from being unloaded at NOLA, shipped up the Mississippi or railed into our Western Canadian shed. So call it 2 months, start to finish to get your phosphate supplies here. So if we're assuming, we need to hit the ground May 1st, and it was interesting hearing some of the presenters earlier talking about the urgency for seeding early, right? So let's hypothetically call it May 1st, 2 months for it to arrive, start to finish. That means you need to have a good majority or a good understanding of what your phosphate requirements are for February 1st. So we've got 2 months. And then on that note, I think it's a good time to add that the Western Canadian landscape is impacted by global factors, right? So fertilizer is a globally traded commodity. We're being impacted by those countervailing duties. And I just want to speak to quickly a few of the other impacts we're seeing in Canada or around the world right now. So the first is the Middle East conflict. it's crazy to think, a conflict in the Middle East is going to affect our fertilizer supply or our fertilizer prices. But the rule of thumb here is, 1 out of every 2 urea tons exported globally comes from this Middle East region. And so when there's tensions there, that's not a good thing, right? The Suez Canal is also a big exporting arm for that geography. And so there's rebels, attacking vessels in this area. And so if we have to see vessels travel around Africa to get its way to global markets, that adds cost, that adds turnaround times, roughly 10 days longer to make it through that channel versus others. Some other factors here are the European natural gas costs. So this was a big factor a few years ago, and we're still seeing some carryover from that with plants that are either operating at reduced operating rates or have just shut down entirely because it's not economical to run them with these high gas costs. So that's tightening global supply, and then the other big one affecting global supply is the lack of Chinese exports. And so China has the capacity to be the world's largest exporter, but over the past few years, and specifically this year, is they've exported very little. And so that's tightening global supplies as well. Shifting gears and looking a little closer to home, some of the North American factors are fluctuating river levels, preventing barges from being unloaded and reloaded. You got in Canada here, we've been dealing with port and rail strikes, so I can tell you firsthand, those aren't good. When you're waiting on phosphate arrivals, and the original CNCP strike date was sometime in May, right? So right in the heart of our application season. So not good, we want to avoid those where possible. The other one, as I mentioned earlier, bonded warehouses for the Moroccan product. And then we've also been hearing reports of shrinking barge fleets, and I believe that has to do with the high cost of steel and just some barge companies choosing not to replace some of these assets as they expire or reach end of life. So that's a bit about the kind of the Western Canadian landscape on NPKS. What I want to do here next is shift gears a little bit into what does our application season look like, the trends, and then also some of the bottlenecks. And so Western Canada is quite unique in that about 85% of our product is all hitting ground at the same time in spring, right? It's extremely congested. And again, we commented on how farmers are wanting to seed earlier, but they're also seeding quite a bit faster, assuming they're not being flooded out here like the past year in Manitoba. But call it 10 to 14 days, we can get through the majority of these fertilizer supplies. So it's an extremely condensed window, which, as you can imagine, adds some challenges for fertilizer logistics. We do have an amount that goes down in fall, right? So typically your ammonia, there's also quite a bit of floating that'll happen in fall, but we're still heavily reliant on this spring market. And what that's done is it's really caused an increased reliance on storage. Storage is king. So whether that's at terminal plants, whether that's at the retailer, or whether that's at farm gate and farm storage. Really quickly here, if you're looking at, our assets, it's tough for me to gauge at what pace, this on-farm storage or storage in general has been growing. But if we look at our network, call it about a third of the product we handle can be stored throughout, one of our facilities. And so that means the other 66% need to move, consistently throughout the rest of the year. If we shift gears and look at the manufacturer, they're very similar, right? They need to keep product moving consistently. The worst thing for them is to have to shut down production because they've hit storage containment. And so the way the market typically works is it's going to reward your earlier purchases through other summer fill or winter fill opportunities. Try to keep the product moving. And so with that, what are the bottlenecks we face here in Western Canada? And the first one I want to talk to is a bit about ammonia storage capacity. So I'm sure a few of you folks have dealt, firsthand with ammonia challenges and logistical challenges on that side. And the main storyline here is it's the storage capacity that's available. So if you're looking at, call our granular storage a third of the total volumes, ammonia is a lot tighter than that. I'd estimate it somewhere around 9 to 10%. And so that means the other 90% needs to move direct from the manufacturer in those two application seasons, whether it's fall or whether it's spring. And so, we have seen some ammonia storage capacity being added, but as I mentioned earlier, it's costly, right? Call $500,000 plus to add a storage bullet at your location, over $5,500 a ton, where if you compare that to granular, it's a couple $100. So we're quite limited in terms of what's economically feasible for increasing ammonia storage. The next one I'd like to speak to here is road bans and trucking capacities. So we're all familiar with road bans coming online sometime early March, limiting the capacities our truckers can carry, limiting some of the road access. But where I want to spend the majority of my time here is on the trucking capacities. And so, June 12, 2022, the use of electronic hour logs has been mandated by Transport Canada. And so if you're looking at a 7-day cycle, truckers can have 70 hours on duty before they're required to have a 36-hour rest period. And then the alternative cycle is on a 14-day period, 120-hour cycle, then they're required a 72-hour reset. And so, as you can imagine, going back to the ammonia slide here, those mandatory reset periods can become a challenge when you're dealing with, just a 3-week application window. And so thankfully there is an exempt permit application process you can go through in spring and fall to allow these carriers to transport on a 12.5-day cycle before they need this rest. And that's available on liquid and ammonias, but it's not available on granular. And so right now we're working with Fertilizer Canada to potentially get a request in place to have the same thing happen on granular products so that we can increase our trucking capacities in season. And then the third challenge I'd speak to is that just-in-time delivery. And so 85% is going down in spring. About 10% of that is the manufacturer's capacity to ship in time. And so the one thing that's in our favor here is that manufacturers are highly motivated to execute in season. Typically it's their best margin product. I can tell you as a buyer, you don't have a whole lot of options when you need the product tomorrow. So that's one reason they want to get product down in place. And then the other is that we're typically going to be facing some form of a summer pricing reset. And so again, if you're a manufacturer, call it mission failed if you end the season long, because that means you're facing a devaluation on your inventory. And so they're going to use multiple different strategies and tools to try to ensure they get their product in place when we need it. I don't know if there's a magic secret sauce here or anything in terms of how you do that. It's going to be done by a combination of forecasting with your customers, acre predictions. Darren mentioned affordability. I'm going to expand on that one a little bit. And then also you have your historical requirements you can reference. Ultimately, when things are hitting the fan, it becomes a bit of a who needs it first and that squeaky wheel. And so that can be a red flag for us here in Manitoba. As you head south and into warmer weather, those areas are seeding first. So, it can be quite nerve-wracking when you're waiting on your phosphate rail cars to arrive and they're being shipped somewhere else because that's where they're seeding. We're still a few weeks away. How am I doing for time here? I think I got a few minutes. So I'm gonna keep going here and talk a bit about how manufacturers do that, and from a high level, how do they do some of their forecasting and just-in-time inventories. If you're a retailer in Manitoba, I gotta throw the plug in here. The best way you can do that is through conversations with your farm customers, right? How much product are you gonna need? When are you gonna need it? Are you using any new products this year? And do you need any services? And ultimately rolling that up into your location's forecast. From a higher level, you're doing the same thing, but then you're also looking at a couple of these key leading indicators. And so the first one is soil and precipitation maps. Right, in theory, from a high level, you're going to want to ship the product where you have the favorable growing seasons. Likely the areas that are in a drought are going to be using less fertilizer, right? So not rocket science on this one. The other thing you're going to be looking at is your highly intensive fertilizing crops. So in Canada, we're going to be monitoring the canola acres through seed bookings and also through forecasts. So this is the Government of Canada forecast. I know it has it at 22 million acres. Not sure. Darren mentioned some good points here earlier just around the affordability and the actual economics of planting canola right now. So maybe that's a little bit high. We'll have to see. And then if you're looking at the States market, they're following corn, right? And so this year they're forecasting 92 million acres. And so one thing you can do is you can monitor, the US's import pace compared to what you think they're going to be using, and that's a pretty big signal. So for us right now, the US is behind on imports, yet we're forecasting some pretty favorable cropping conditions. And so, in theory, you want to likely stay ahead of that. Again, I keep referencing Darren's presentation because there's a lot of tie-ins here, but I was glad to see we're looking at the same things. So I have basically the same slide here, monitoring affordability. That's the last thing you're going to kind of look at in terms of gauging your final demand. So as Darren already went through this, so I'm going to skip over it, but urea is close to average, but slightly on the less economical side. And the really bad one here is phosphates. So 36 extra bushels of wheat to pay for that same ton of phos, and on canola, 16 to 17 more bushels of canola to pay for that same ton of phos. So that's huge, right? So we're going to be factoring in some form of demand destruction. What does that look like? It's hard to tell. Lots of discussions, is it 5 to 10, is it 10 to 15, but something you're going to have to account for when you're positioning product. The other thing I would comment on here is that the poor MAP affordability is leading to delayed purchases, and I don't blame it. I get it. You're doing the math on your return on investment opportunity. This isn't penciling, right? So I'm not going to buy today. I'm going to see if my prices drop, or am I just going to use less? And so again, this is a tough one to balance, right? Because earlier I'm talking about having to have your lineups in the majority of your positions sometime in February. The more those booking systems get delayed, that's hard to get right. And so if you get it wrong, that's where you're going to see some of your supply outages. So that's kind of what I have here today. If I'm just recapping a couple, quick hitters in terms of how we can best manage fertilizer supply, again, the plug here is, open approach with your retail. Have those discussions, look at your fertility plans, give them an opportunity to get the product you need in time, right? The other one I'm going to plug is ownership is 9/10 of the law, right? So when you're dealing with that 85% of your volume going down in spring, you're not going to be dealing with the logistical challenges if it's on your farm already. So that's a big one. These next two, I'm coming from a pure logistics standpoint, not from an agronomy standpoint. So I'm sure that I'm going to get challenged or maybe yelled at afterwards on these two. But consider application methods outside of your typical, that spring period. Potentially is fall appa an opportunity or not. And then again, pulling ammonia as early as possible because we know that window is fairly compressed. I believe Regis is after me. I'm sure he might talk about this one a little bit further. Again, from the fertilizer logistics guy, anything we can do to stretch out that window is good. And then the last one, communicate with your carriers. They're dealing with road bans, they're dealing with hour log restrictions. So ensure you have a plan in place for how much volume you need to move in season, and ensure you have the trucking capacities to match. So that's all I got. Thanks very much, everyone.
That was great. Thanks. I should have had that talk about 30 years ago when I moved to Manitoba. So I appreciate that wonderful, clear, concise background that you put together for us. Going to see, is there one question from the audience here that we might have? Marla, I think you said there was a question from there, but I don't want to deal with that. Oh, yep.
You just want to repeat, I don't mean like. There's rumors that a lot of Western Canada retailers are bringing in DAP instead of MAP. Has that hit your radar?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question is, there's a rumor that retailers are bringing in DAP instead of MAP. I don't want to get into too many specifics about what retailers are doing what, but yeah, that has hit our radar. I am aware of a few different companies doing that. We haven't done that to date, but I'm not surprised, right? When you go back to that fertilizer affordability on the MAP standpoint, people are looking for other options. So yeah, I can hear Regis saying it's not a good idea, so I'll let him expand on it, but yeah.
What about meds? Like, how does meds fit into that with DAP and MAP? Like, with affordability, because you got sulfur.
That's not a big problem in the US.
No, meds is not out here? Oh, okay, sorry.
S15, yes.
So,
Nobody online can
Yep,
hear.
that's
so-
okay, we didn't want to answer that online. And so, thank you very much, Kevin. We're going to do that, and join me in thanking